have known Sarah since freshman orientation at the University of Florida, a lifetime ago. We were inseparable, the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences and share spare keys without thinking twice. When she called me 3 months ago, sobbing about how her boyfriend, Mark, had cleared out their shared bank account and disappeared with the lease still in his name, my heart just broke for her. It was a no-brainer. I told her to pack her bags and come stay with me in my apartment in Chicago. I have a decent-sized place, a 2-bedroom in Lincoln Park. And at the time, the 2nd bedroom was just a glorified storage unit for boxes of books and old clothes I hadn't touched in years. I told her she could stay as long as she needed to get back on her feet. I honestly thought it would be a bonding experience, a return to the days when we stayed up until 3 a.m. talking about our futures while eating lukewarm pizza on the floor. My husband David was hesitant at first. He is a quiet guy, a senior project manager who cherishes his routine and his quiet evenings after a long day of navigating corporate politics. He likes his home to be his sanctuary, his place to decompress. And I knew that inviting someone else into that space, especially someone going through a traumatic breakup, would disrupt that equilibrium. But he loved me, and he saw how much Sarah meant to me. He squeezed my hand, sighed that familiar sigh that meant he was compromising for my sake, and told me it was fine. He even helped me clear out the spare room, hauling boxes to the basement, making the bed with fresh linens, and acting like the perfect host. For the first few weeks, it was actually nice. We fell back into our old rhythm, drinking wine on the balcony, venting about our jobs, and binge-watching reality television until our eyes burned. David was patient. He'd come home from work, greet us both, maybe share a beer with Sarah if she was already out in the living area, and then retreat to the office or the bedroom to read or work on his own projects. He was the picture of a supportive husband. I felt incredibly lucky. I had the man I loved and my best friend under one roof, and for a short window of time, everything felt balanced. That changed about a month into her stay. I started noticing small things, shifts in the atmosphere that I dismissed as my own anxiety. It started with the way Sarah began dressing around the apartment. She was always stylish, but she started opting for silk robes and lace-trimmed camisoles that seemed a little too intimate for a casual Tuesday evening in front of the television. I'd walk out of the bathroom and find her sitting on the arm of the sofa, closer to where David usually sat, her body language open and deliberate. I chalked it up to her trying to feel feminine again after the disaster with Mark. She was hurt, she was vulnerable, and maybe she was just craving some sort of validation, even if it was subconscious. Then there were the dinners. I started coming home a bit later because of a surge in my workload, and I'd walk in to find them already eating. It wasn't just a simple meal. They would be sitting at the island, the candles lit, the music turned down low, talking with an intensity that seemed to evaporate the moment I walked through the door. David would get up, clear his throat, and start explaining that he just whipped up some pasta because he was hungry, and Sarah would offer me a glass of wine with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. It felt like walking into a room where a secret had just been told, but the doors were being slammed shut the second I arrived. I pushed the thoughts away. My brain did mental gymnastics to justify it. They were both just trying to make the best of a weird living situation. They were two people I loved, and they were trying to be friends. It was a testament to David's character, really, that he was so welcoming. I felt a pang of guilt for even wondering if there was something more. I was projecting, I told myself. I was the one who was stressed and overworked, and I was looking for problems where there were none. But then, the quiet moments started feeling heavier. I began to notice the way David's eyes would linger on her when he thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't a blatant stare, but a subtle, lingering focus that felt like a betrayal of his usual habit of looking at me when I spoke. And Sarah, she started changing her behavior around me. She stopped asking about my day. She stopped telling me the details of her own life. Instead, she spent hours in the kitchen whenever David was around, laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny, touching his arm just a little too long, or leaning in to show him something on her phone with a proximity that made my skin crawl. The air in the apartment felt thick, charged with a static electricity that made it hard to breathe. One night, I came home earlier than expected. A meeting had been canceled and the traffic was unusually light. I let myself in, expecting to find them in the living room or maybe out for a run. The house was deathly quiet. I walked toward the bedroom, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor, and as I neared the hallway, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. They weren't talking, they were whispering. It was a low, urgent murmur that sounded like a conversation that was never meant for my ears. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was undeniable. It was the tone of two people sharing something private, something heavy. I stood there, frozen, feeling like an intruder in my own home. I wanted to walk in, to be the person I was before, but a wave of nausea washed over me. I turned around and walked back out the front door, standing in the cold Chicago wind, shaking. I sat in my car for 2 hours, watching the front window of my apartment, waiting for a sign, waiting for a change, waiting for something that would prove I was just being insane. My mind raced. How could this happen? My best friend and my husband, the two anchors of my life. It felt like a sick, twisted joke. Every memory I had of the last month began to play back in my head, rewritten with this new, terrifying lens. The way he helped her unpack. The way she suddenly had a reason to stay in the living room until the moment I went to bed. The way they exchanged glances that I had previously labeled as friendly, but now looked like a private language I wasn't privy to. I started remembering the times I had left them alone to go to the grocery store, or to take a conference call, or even just to get some space. How long had they been planning this? Was I the only one who didn't know? The anger began to bubble up, hot and sharp, burning in my chest. I wanted to kick the door down, to scream until my lungs gave out, to throw them both out into the street. But I didn't. I sat there in the dark, my phone glowing with missed messages from work, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I was terrified. I was terrified that if I confronted them, if I exposed the rot that I was starting to suspect, my entire life would collapse. I had built a home, a marriage, a future, based on the belief that these two people were loyal. If that was a lie, what else was? I felt like I was standing on a trapdoor, and with every passing second, the latch was loosening. I kept thinking about the look in David's eyes, the way he used to look at me, and I felt a grief so profound it was physical. It was as if I was mourning him while he was still sitting 20 feet away from me. I finally pulled myself together and went back inside. I put on my best mask, the one that said I was tired, I had a long day, I was just going to go to bed. I walked past the kitchen. They were both there, drinking tea, the atmosphere suddenly tense. David looked up, his expression unreadable, and asked me how the meeting went. I lied. I said it was fine, just boring, that I wanted to get some sleep. I saw Sarah's eyes flicker toward him, a quick, almost imperceptible movement, and then she looked at me with a smile that felt like glass. It was so fragile, so hollow, that it practically shattered in the air between us. I went to our bedroom, closed the door, and leaned my back against the wood, sliding down until I hit the floor. The apartment felt like a prison. I could hear their muffled voices through the wall, the low hum of their conversation that felt like a dull ache in my head. I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of my life being dismantled by the people I trusted the most. I realized then that my life would never be the same. The comfort of my home was gone, replaced by a paranoia that felt like it was eating me alive from the inside out. I had brought her here to save her, and in doing so, I had invited the wolf into the fold. Every little noise, every creak in the floorboards, every whisper made me feel like I was going insane. I wanted to wake up, to find out it was all a dream, to have the old David and the old Sarah back. But the reality was staring me in the face. A cold, hard, undeniable fact that I was going to have to face head on. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to survive the truth. But I knew one thing for sure. The person I was when I walked through that door this morning was dead, and the woman who would walk out tomorrow was going to have to be a stranger to herself. The next few days were a blur of performative normalcy. I moved through my routines like a ghost, haunting the hallways of my own home, observing David and Sarah as if they were specimens in a petri dish. I became a master of the peripheral vision, constantly catching glimpses of the way they stood, never quite touching, but always aligned, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that screamed intimacy. It was the little things that cut the deepest. It was the way David bought the specific brand of oat milk that Sarah preferred, something he had never bothered to do before she arrived. It was the way Sarah would subtly adjust her sweater when David walked into the room, a reflexive vanity that made my stomach turn. I found myself obsessing over the details, replaying every interaction, every shared look, every moment of silence. I stopped eating at home, using late meetings as a convenient excuse to stay away from the apartment. I needed the distance, but I also needed the information. I started coming home at irregular hours, hoping to catch them in a moment of vulnerability, a slip in their well-rehearsed charade. I felt like a detective in my own life, hunting for evidence of a crime that had already devastated me. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. I had spent years priding myself on our communication, on the openness and honesty that defined our marriage, and yet, here I was, drowning in a sea of secrets and lies. David noticed, of course. He would ask me, with that infuriatingly calm and concerned expression, if everything was okay at work. He'd reach out to touch my shoulder, and I would flinch, a reaction I tried to hide by pretending I was reaching for something or adjusting my clothes. He would frown, his eyebrows furrowing in that way that used to make me feel cared for, but now only made me feel manipulated. Sarah was worse. She played the part of the grateful guest with a proficiency that was almost chilling. She would ask how my day was, offer to run errands, and act as if our friendship was as solid as it had ever been. Sometimes I would look at her, really look at her, and try to find the girl I had known since college, the one who had cried on my shoulder when she failed her midterms, the one who had stood by my side at my wedding. But she was gone. The person standing in front of me was a stranger, a woman who had decided that my husband was a prize to be stolen, or perhaps a temptation too great to resist. I wondered what they talked about when I wasn't there. Did they laugh about me? Did they pity me? Did they feel guilty? Or was I just an obstacle in their path, a nuisance to be managed until they could finally be together without the pretense? The breaking point arrived on a rainy Thursday night. I had told them I was going to be late again, but I had actually parked my car in the garage, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark for over an hour. I wanted to see if they were as careful as they thought they were. I went upstairs, letting myself in with my key, making no sound as I stepped onto the foyer mat. I took off my shoes, holding them in my hands, and crept toward the living room. The lights were dimmed, just a soft glow from a floor lamp in the corner. I heard music playing, something slow and melodic that I didn't recognize. I walked silently to the edge of the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. There they were, sitting on the sofa, not talking, just watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Sarah had her head resting on the back of the couch, and David was sitting close, his hand resting on the fabric inches from her leg. They weren't touching, not overtly, but the space between them was electric, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. I stood there, watching them for what felt like an eternity, feeling a strange, hollow coldness seep into my bones. Then, Sarah turned her head and looked at him. The expression on her face, the way her eyes softened, the way her lips parted, it was an expression of pure, unadulterated longing. It was the look she used to give me when we were in college, a look of connection that I had foolishly believed was reserved for me. I didn't scream. I didn't run into the room and start throwing things. I just stood there, paralyzed by the sheer banality of it all. This wasn't some dramatic, high-stakes affair played out in hotels. It was happening in my living room, under the soft light of a lamp to the sound of jazz music. It was intimate in a way that made me feel invisible. I backed away, step by quiet step, until I was safely in the hallway, and then I turned and walked out the front door, closing it silently behind me. I sat in my car, trembling, the rain drumming against the roof, and I realized that my silence was becoming my own form of betrayal. By not speaking, by not confronting them, I was complicit in this slow-motion car crash. I was letting them rewrite the narrative of my life, letting them turn my sanctuary into a stage for their secret drama. My anger began to crystallize, turning from a hot, chaotic mess into something cold and hard and focused. I wasn't going to let them get away with this, but I couldn't afford to be messy. I had to be smart. I had to be colder than they were. I started thinking about the financial aspect of it, about the way David handled our investments, about the way he had been pushing for us to merge our accounts fully just a few months before Sarah arrived. Was that a coincidence? Was he planning for an exit? For a life where he could keep his assets and walk away with someone new? The thought sent a jolt of clarity through me. If this was really happening, if they really were plotting behind my back, I needed to know the scope of it. I went home the next morning, early, while they were still asleep. I went straight to David's home office, a room he usually kept locked, but which he had forgotten to secure in his haste to get to work the previous evening. My hands shook as I sat down at his computer. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew that the truth was buried somewhere in the digital footprint of his life. I opened his emails, his browser history, his bank statements. I spent hours digging, my eyes burning from the screen, my stomach churning with every click. And there it was, not an email, not a text, but a series of transactions. Transfers to a separate account, a secret savings fund that had been growing steadily for the past 6 months. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to start a new life, to buy a small apartment, to disappear. And then I found the message. It was a draft in his email, addressed to a realtor, asking about short-term rentals in a city 3 states away. The date was from 2 weeks ago. He was planning to leave. He was planning to leave me, and he was taking Sarah with him. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind out of my lungs. It wasn't just an affair. It was an escape plan. My husband and my best friend were coordinating an exit, and I was just the final obstacle, the person who needed to be managed, pacified, and eventually discarded. The feeling of betrayal was so absolute, it left me feeling vacant. I sat in his chair, in his office, and felt the walls closing in. I thought about all the times I had worried about being a good wife, about making our home a place of peace, about supporting his career. All of it was just filler, noise to keep me occupied while he prepared to abandon me. I felt a surge of contempt for myself, for being so blind, so trusting, so utterly pathetic in my devotion to people who were actively planning my ruin. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the street below. People were going about their lives, walking their dogs, heading to work, oblivious to the fact that worlds were being dismantled behind closed doors. I realized that the life I had known was a performance, and I was the only one who hadn't been given the script. I needed to act, but I needed to do it on my own terms. I closed the computer, wiped my fingerprints from the mouse and the desk, and left the office, making sure to lock it behind me. I went into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was different. Her eyes were hard, her jaw was set, and there was a cold, unfamiliar fire burning behind her gaze. I was done being the victim. If they wanted to play a game, then I would show them just how well I could play too. I went back to the living room and sat down, waiting for them to wake up. I was perfectly calm, my mind racing with plans and scenarios. I needed to gather more evidence, to lock down the assets, to protect myself from the impending disaster. I wasn't going to make a scene, not yet. I was going to let them continue their little charade, let them believe that they were still in control, while I methodically dismantled their escape route piece by piece. I realized that my pain was an asset, a tool I could use to sharpen my focus. I wouldn't let it destroy me. I would use it to fuel the fire that was going to burn their little fantasy to the ground. I heard footsteps in the hall. David, coming to start his day. I didn't turn around. I just kept my eyes on the window, watching the morning light catch the dust motes in the air. He walked into the room, his eyes scanning for me, and when he saw me sitting there, he stopped. He looked surprised, maybe a little guilty, but he quickly smoothed his expression into one of concern. He asked me how I slept, his voice smooth and practiced. I turned and looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I truly saw him. Not as the man I married, but as a man who was capable of the most profound cruelty. I smiled at him, a small, genuine smile that didn't reach my eyes, and told him I slept just fine, that I had a lot to think about, and that I was looking forward to the day ahead. He seemed relieved, his shoulders dropping just a fraction, and he went to the kitchen to start the coffee. I watched him go, a predator in my own home, and I knew that this was only the beginning. The days turned into a calculated game of chess, where I held every piece, even if they didn't know the board was being rearranged. I became a ghost in my own apartment, moving with a predatory silence that allowed me to listen, to observe, and to catalog every single betrayal. I started keeping a private journal, not on paper, but on a hidden partition of my laptop, documenting every transaction, every suspicious call, and every instance where the masks they wore slipped just enough for me to see the rot underneath. It was exhausting, a physical weight that pressed against my chest every time I had to sit at the dinner table and listen to them talk about their day. David talking about his projects, Sarah nodding with that sickeningly sweet encouragement, knowing that they were discussing their future, a future that excluded me entirely. I spent my days at work operating on pure adrenaline, my nights planning the logistics of my survival. I started shifting my own liquid assets into a private account that David couldn't access, a nest egg that would ensure I wouldn't be left destitute when the inevitable explosion occurred. I played the part of the unsuspecting, slightly checked-out wife, occasionally mentioning that I was busy with a new high-profile project to explain my own absences and my lack of engagement with them. They bought it. They were so wrapped up in their own narcissism, so convinced that I was too weak and too trusting to see the truth, that they didn't even notice me pulling away from the anchor. One afternoon, I came home to find the apartment smelling of expensive perfume and cooked salmon. It was an anniversary dinner. Not ours, but the anniversary of the day they first met, which I remembered because Sarah had bragged about it back in college. They were standing in the kitchen, the wine flowing, laughing with a familiarity that made my blood run cold. I walked in, dropped my bag on the floor, and watched the color drain from their faces. The air, which had been thick with their secret, suddenly turned brittle and sharp. David immediately moved to hide something on his phone, while Sarah quickly reached for a glass as if to offer me a drink. I didn't say a word. I just walked past them, my heart hammering, and went into the bedroom. I knew I needed to do something drastic. The waiting game was starting to erode my own sanity. I had the evidence of the secret account, I had the dates of the transactions, and I had the proof of their planned departure, but I needed something more definitive, something that would make it impossible for them to lie their way out of it when the time came. I needed them to think they were safe, to feel the height of their arrogance before I cut the ground out of under them. I decided to go out for the night, leaving them alone in the apartment. I told them I was going to an industry networking event and that I might stay out late. I saw the relief wash over them, a split-second relaxation of their posture that confirmed exactly what they were thinking. They thought they had the coast clear. I drove a few blocks away, parked my car in a grocery store lot, and took an Uber back to the apartment building. I had an extra key that I had hidden in the utility closet, one they didn't know existed because David had only ever kept track of the main set. I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears, and stood outside my own front door. I could hear the faint sound of music inside, the bass vibrating through the wood. I listened for a long time, hearing the rhythm of their voices, the way they moved through the living room, the clinking of glasses. My mind was screaming at me to walk away, to just end it, to cut the cord and move on. But my need for the truth was a physical hunger. I wanted to see it. I wanted the image to be seared into my brain so that I could never, ever forget why I was doing what I had to do. I unlocked the door, turning the key with a precision that felt like surgery, and slipped inside. The lights in the living room were low, dimmed to a romantic amber hue. They were on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the television. I didn't make a sound. I moved through the shadows of the hallway, my eyes locked on them. I was watching them with the detachment of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. They were laughing, a low, intimate sound. And then David leaned in, his hand tracing the line of Sarah's jaw, his thumb brushing against her lower lip. She didn't push him away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her lips parting as she sighed his name. I stood there, witnessing the death of my past and the birth of my new reality. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a total erasure. They were creating a new life in the space where I had lived, worked, and loved for years. The sheer audacity of it, the coldness of their selfishness, finally broke the last remaining strand of my attachment to them. I wasn't just angry, I was liberated. I realized then that I didn't need them, that I hadn't needed them for a long time. I was stronger than this, and more importantly, I was smarter. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to cry. I needed to act. I crept back toward the door, my movements fluid and silent. I had seen enough. I had the confirmation I needed to finish what I had started, to secure my legal and financial safety, and to set the trap that would ensure they would never, ever be able to recover. I stepped out into the hallway, pulling the doors shut behind me, the latch clicking with a finality that sounded like a verdict. I walked down the stairs, out into the cool Chicago night, and as I walked toward the corner to hail an Uber, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The air was crisp, the city lights shimmering in the puddles on the sidewalk, and for the first time in months, I felt clear-headed. I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to let them take anything else from me.
I had the evidence, I had the strategy, and I had the resolve to burn their little fantasy to the ground. I pulled my phone from my pocket and started drafting the email to the lawyer I had been quietly consulting for the past 2 weeks, attaching the files I had meticulously gathered. I was ready to initiate the final phase of the operation, the one that would leave them standing in the ruins of the life they had tried to steal. I didn't look back at the building. I didn't think about the man I thought I knew or the friend I had opened my home to. They were already ghosts, artifacts of a version of me that no longer existed. I was the one in control now, and I was going to ensure that their exit from my life would be exactly as painful and as chaotic as they deserved. The next morning, the sun bled into the bedroom through the curtains, a cruel, bright reminder that the world had not stopped turning, even if mine had completely imploded. I stayed in bed for an hour, mapping out every move. I had contacted the lawyer, the papers were drawn up, and the evidence, every bank statement, every digital footprint, the time-stamped logs of their little midnight rendezvous, was sitting in a secure cloud drive, ready to be weaponized. I walked into the kitchen, my movements measured and calm, to find them at the island. They were drinking coffee, the silence between them less like comfort and more like a shared, nervous anticipation.
David looked up, and for the first time, he didn't try to hide his expression. He looked tired. He looked like a man who was exhausted by the act, ready to pull the trigger on his own life. Sarah looked at me, her eyes darting to David's, a look of desperate uncertainty crossing her face. They knew something had shifted. They didn't know what, but they could smell the change in the air. I didn't offer a greeting. I didn't even acknowledge their presence. I went to the fridge, poured a glass of water, and then walked over to the counter where David kept his mail. I picked up a document, leafed through it slowly, and then looked at him. I saw his hand tighten around his coffee mug. I smiled, a slow, thin expression that held absolutely no warmth. I told them we needed to talk. It wasn't a request, it was a command. I walked into the living room and sat in the center chair, the one that faced the sofa, framing them perfectly. David stood up, his face pale. Sarah tried to say something, a weak, stuttering attempt at a pleasantry, but I cut her off with a sharp wave of my hand. I didn't need to hear her voice. I didn't need to hear the lies she had spent months perfecting. I started speaking, and my voice was remarkably steady, the product of the last few weeks of rehearsing this exact moment in my head. I laid it all out. I didn't hold back a single detail.
I started with the day she arrived, the day I thought I was being a good friend, and how I had been paying for her presence with my own sanity. I talked about the way they moved through the house like they owned it, the way they looked at each other when they thought I was oblivious, and the way they had systematically plotted to replace me in my own life. David tried to interrupt, to claim that I was being paranoid, that it was all in my head, but I silenced him with a single look. I pulled out my phone and played the recording I had made the night before, just the audio of them sitting on the couch, the intimacy in their voices so thick it was suffocating. The room went deathly still. Sarah's hands were shaking, her coffee sloshing over the side of the mug. David just stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the mask of the doting, quiet husband finally shattering. I didn't stop there. I went into the financial betrayal, describing the secret account, the plan to move away, the betrayal of our marriage, and the calculated nature of their exit strategy. I saw the realization hit them that they hadn't been clever, that they hadn't been subtle,
and that they had been playing against a master. David's face turned a shade of gray that made me think he might actually faint. He tried to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but I stood up and walked toward him, stopping only inches away. I told him that he was free to leave, that he could take his bags and go wherever he wanted, but he was going to walk out with nothing. I had frozen the accounts, I had locked the assets, and I had ensured that the divorce proceedings would be public, ugly, and ruinous. I wasn't going to make it easy for him. I wasn't going to let him slide into a new life with a clean slate. I was going to ensure that everyone knew exactly what he was and exactly what he had done. Sarah started to cry then, a high, thin sound that grated on my nerves. She tried to reach out to me, to touch my arm, but I recoiled as if she were a snake. I told her that she was the biggest disappointment of my life, that she was a parasite who had fed on my kindness until there was nothing left to give. I told her to get her things, to get out of my sight, and to never contact me again. I told her that if she stayed in the city, I would make sure her reputation was just as decimated as her character. She looked at me with a mix of shock and hatred, the mask completely off now, the desperate, selfish woman beneath fully exposed. David looked at her, then back at me, the alliance between them crumbling before my eyes. They were both looking for a way out, a way to spin this, but there was no spin that could fix what I had laid out. I walked to the door, opened it, and leaned against the frame. I told them they had 1 hour. 1 hour to pack their things, 1 hour to clear out of my life, and 1 hour before I called the police for trespassing. The tension in the apartment was so thick it was suffocating. For a moment, nobody moved. It was a standoff, a final confrontation between the people I had loved and the woman they had turned me into. I checked my watch, my movements precise and cold. I told them that the clock was ticking, and that every second they wasted was a second that would be used against them in the proceedings to come. David stood up, his posture slumped, his arrogance gone. He didn't even look at me as he walked toward the hallway to grab his things. Sarah lingered, her eyes filled with a weird, defiant anger, but she didn't say a word. She just turned and followed him, the sound of their footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. I stood in the doorway, watching them move through the rooms, hearing the sound of drawers being opened and closed, the rustle of clothing, the frantic packing of 2 lives that were no longer welcome in mine. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel heartbreak. I felt a cold, sharp, and exhilarating sense of power. I had done it. I had taken back my life, and I was going to make sure that they paid for every minute of the misery they had inflicted on me. The countdown had begun, and for the first time in months, the future didn't look like a threat. It looked like an opportunity. The hour passed in a blur of frantic movement and heavy, suffocating silence. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the street, my heart beating with a steady, metronomic rhythm that felt entirely new. Every time a door slammed or a bag zipped in the back of the apartment, it felt like a structural wall of my previous life being knocked down. When they finally emerged from the guest room, David was carrying 2 large suitcases, and Sarah was clutching a single, overflowing duffel bag. They looked diminished, smaller somehow, stripped of the bravado they had carried for the last 3 months. They didn't look at me as they walked toward the entryway. The air was charged with a finality that made the atmosphere feel thin and cold. David reached for his keys, then remembered I had already changed the access codes and the lock on the building entry, and he looked at me with a mix of fury and pathetic helplessness. I didn't say a word. I just stood up, walked over, and opened the door, holding it wide until they both stepped out into the hallway. The look Sarah gave me just before she crossed the threshold, a mixture of cold, hard spite and fear, was the final confirmation I needed. She knew, just as David knew, that I wasn't just kicking them out. I was closing the door on their version of reality forever. When I heard the elevator ding and their footsteps fade down the corridor, I didn't collapse. I didn't sob. I walked straight to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of wine, and poured a glass, then stood in the middle of my living room and simply breathed. The silence was absolute.
It was no longer the heavy, stifling silence of a home filled with secrets. It was the pristine, clean silence of a space that was finally mine again. I walked through the apartment, room by room, feeling the phantom presence of their lives evaporating with every step. I went into the guest room where Sarah had lived for the last months and saw the indentations on the mattress where she had sat, the lingering scent of her perfume in the air. I stripped the sheets off the bed, wadded them into a ball, and threw them into the trash. It wasn't enough to just have them gone. I needed to purge the remnants of their existence from my environment.
সাগরের ঢেউ দেখিয়া নাই মন সাগরে নানা মিলে সাধন ভজন সকলি যাই বিফলে গো সকলি যাই বিফলে ওরে রূপ সাগরের ঢেউ দেখিয়া নাই মন সাগরে নানা মিলে সাধন ভজন সকলি যাই বিফলে গো সকলি যাই বিফলে আহা সাগরের দুই মোহনা একটি আশায় একটি যাওয়া সাধক যারা নাই মোতারা সাধক যাহারা নাই মোতারা সাধক যারা নাই মোতারা সাধক সারা যাই ডুবে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে সাগরের খাইছো ননি আসিয়া এই ববেতে ওরে আরেক সাগরটাকে তোমায় নিতে তার মোহনাতে গো নিতে তার মোহনাতে ও এক সাগরের খাইছো ননি আসিয়া এই ববেতে আরেক সাগরটাকে তোমায় নিতে তার মোহনাতে গো নিতে তার মোহনাতে ওরে মোহনাতে জুয়ার বাটা মোহনাতে জুয়ার বাটা না জানিয়া যাব দিলে মন মরবি অকালে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে সাগরের সাধক যারা তারা নাই মা সাগরে আরে এক চুমুকে শুকাই পানি ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে গো ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে ওরে রূপসাগরের সাধক যারা তারা নাই মা সাগরে এক চুমুকে শুকাই পানি ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে গো ডুবার বয়তার না থাকে ওরে জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা জয় বেবে কয় সাধক সারা জুয়ার আসলে যাই ডুবে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে মনে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে রূপসাগরে ডুব দিও না সাঁতার না জানলে
I moved to the office, to the computer where I had uncovered the betrayal, and deleted every file, every record, every piece of evidence. I didn't need it anymore. The act of the cleanup was the final closure, a physical manifestation of moving on.
The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal filings and logistical shifts. The divorce was not the messy, public spectacle I had initially threatened. It was a swift, cold, and efficient dismantling of a partnership. My lawyers were relentless, and because I had gathered the documentation of the secret accounts and the clear intent of his departure, David didn't have a leg to stand on.
He wanted to negotiate, to try to paint a picture of a misunderstood marriage, but I refused to speak to him directly. Everything went through the attorneys. I learned later, through a mutual acquaintance, that the fresh start he and Sarah had planned failed almost immediately. Without the financial buffer he had siphoned, and with the stress of the impending legal fallout, their relationship became what it always was, a fragile construct built on deception and convenience. They didn't have the foundation to weather the consequences, and watching them unravel from a distance was, in its own way, the sweetest part of the aftermath. I stopped being the woman who lived for other people's validation. I stopped being the wife who managed a household while her husband and friend plotted against her. I took the money that was rightfully mine. I moved to a different part of the city, and I started over. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness was sharp, when the memory of what I had lost would wash over me in a wave of grief. But it was a clean grief, not a poisoned one. I had reclaimed my integrity, and I had learned the most expensive lesson of my life. That trust is not a birthright. It is a privilege that must be earned and protected. I look back at the woman who stood in that hallway, watching them leave, and I feel a profound sense of gratitude toward her. She was the one who refused to be broken. She was the one who, when confronted with the ultimate betrayal, decided that the only way forward was to be the architect of her own survival. I am not the same person I was a year ago. I am colder, perhaps, or maybe just more focused. I have learned to read people differently, to see the cracks in their masks before they ever have the chance to widen. I don't look back anymore. I don't wonder what they are doing, and I don't care about their excuses. My life is a testament to the fact that you can survive the worst, that you can be lied to, stolen from, and abandoned by the people you trusted most, and still come out on the other side, whole. It is a quiet, steady, and peaceful existence, and for the first time in my life, that is enough. I have my own home, my own secrets, and a sense of self that no one can ever take away from me again. I finally understand that the moment I bit my lip at his size, at the audacity of his betrayal, and didn't push him away, was the exact moment I started to wake up. It was the moment I stopped being a participant in my own destruction and started becoming the survivor of my own story. And that, in the end, was the only victory that mattered.
বাসরে ঘুমাও তুমি কারে নিয়ে চলো আমায় রেখে কেন প্রিয়া গিয়াছ রে বলো কার বাসরে ঘুমাও তুমি কারে নিয়ে চলো আমায় রেখে কেন প্রিয়া গিয়াছ রে বলো কার মনেতে তোমার আশা রাখো জমা করে আমার আশা পুইরা দিয়া তুমি রইলা দূরে স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই স্বার্থবাদী তুই তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই স্বার্থবাদী তুই তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে চলো নারী আসতে ভালো বললে রে তুই আশাগুলো দিয়ে চইলা গেলে কষ্ট দিয়া নতুন সাথী নিয়ে বাসতে ভালো বললে রে তুই আশাগুলো দিয়ে চইলা গেলে কষ্ট দিয়া নতুন সাথী নিয়ে তোর প্রেমেরই মন্ত্র ছিল অভিনয়ের জাল, তোর কথা বিশ্বাস কইরা হইল আমার কাল। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে সলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে সলো নারী সুর। কার মনেতে বাসা বাঁধো আমায় রেখে রে, কার মুখেতে ফুটাও হাসি আমায় কাঁদিয়ে। কার মনেতে বাসা বাঁধো আমায় রেখে রে, কার মুখেতে ফুটাও হাসি আমায় কাঁদিয়ে। স্বার্থ নিয়া করলে খেলায় আমার সাথে রে, পর ভাবিয়া দূরে গেলে আমায় রেখে রে। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে সলো নারী সুর। স্বার্থবাদী প্রিয়া রে তুই, স্বার্থবাদী তুই, তোর মনেতে ছিল হাইরে সলো